start with a roll. Oh, there we go. We'll start with a roll call. McKee here, Nichols.
Here.
Schultz.
Here.
And John and Manoj are not going to be here, so they are excused. We can go down the line of the Planning Commission. Dean Jacobs.
Here.
Dean Varenkamp.
Here.
Jim Schulak.
Here.
Mark Lanterman.
Here.
Meredith Wu, is she? I don't see her name on the list. Is she on?
Don't believe so, but I think she's working with Brad to get on.
Sounds good. Did I miss someone? Forgot my list. I think that's everyone, right? I got all of them? Perfect. Then we will get started. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited for this. It's been a long time coming. So, oh, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, sorry. Kendra, if you'd like to get us started with the presentation and take it from there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members, commissioners. Tonight is our joint meeting, and our agenda tonight is to talk about what a working title I have is Urban Cluster Ordinance. And I'm going to share my screen here.
Maybe we should get a new name, because normally when people say, what a cluster.
Well, fair enough.
Any proposals there, Chair Jacobs?
No.
Okay. All right. So lost my.
I've got one, urban efficiency ordinance.
There you go.
Or urban conservation ordinance would also work.
Another good one.
I'm going to stop my screen share for a second again. I don't know what's happening here. I apologize. I've never had problems sharing it before, but for some reason this is not happy.
Well, it was up there a second ago.
Yeah, it popped up for a little bit.
Okay, I think I got it back here. Back up?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. Anyway, so the City Council established a number of priorities for 2021, and one of those was working on a urban cluster ordinance. And at the after some discussion at the April 22nd meeting, the council refined that discussion, and after given some options, said our real goal is to preserve open space in general. And so we had discussion at that meeting about how much open space should be required in exchange for what kind of flexibility. And so we went back at staff level and talked about different options. We were directed to bring back some development examples. And so I'm just going to walk through quickly what was in your packet and then leave it for the council commission discussion. So as a starting point, we did this exhibit. It might look familiar to some of the planning commission. We did this exhibit a couple of years ago to show that in fact in Corcoran with wetlands, which are probably on every piece of land we've seen, you can still do a compliant subdivision in the RSF2 district that meets our lot size, lot width requirements. And so that's where we started from. We said, here's RSF2. Now, if we're trying to preserve open space within that, and we said in the urban clusters, open space did not include wetlands or stormwater ponds. So it's just pure upland area. So an example of 20% open space, what would that do to lot size? Yeah, 20%, we're probably still looking at significantly smaller lots. Again, this is one example. Every site's different. It could look a little bit different, but we need to meet the density goals adopted as part of our comprehensive plan on the entire site at 3 to 5 units an acre. And so when you cluster that density, you don't get to deduct this open space that you're preserving. So now you're taking the same amount of density and putting it on a smaller area. So the lot sizes got smaller with 20%, but you could still do single family homes similar to what we've seen in other developments. 30%, they squeeze a bit more. I think you can still at a 30% probably do some single family homes, but you're more likely starting to look at a mix of single family and twin homes. At 40% open space, we really couldn't figure out a way to do it without moving to a townhome model in order to meet the 3 units per acre density. So 40%, we started to move to some smaller townhome units. These are row townhomes with up to 6 units in a building. And then in order to preserve 50% open space, we really did need to move to a townhouse model. And again, we were modeling on this RSF2 zoning district. So the council talked about those as options at the April meeting, and we wanted to give you an idea of what that might look like. So in the draft we prepared, it's really a draft for discussion. The framework was based on the organizational structure of the open space and preservation plat. And so we put this platting process in the subdivision ordinance with the idea that we would allow people to do this by right, meaning they come in with a plat that complies, they don't need a PUD, they don't need anything special. And we give them that incentive to preserve the open space. And so in the example we did, we proposed it for the LDR district, put some bumpers around the design guidelines saying in that RSF2 district, you can do smaller lots and you can do single family homes or twin homes. Twin homes would normally be not allowed by right in that district. And in the RSF3 district, you could do single family homes, twin homes, and townhomes. So again, you get to add a different product in exchange for preserving the open space. A lot of the ordinances we looked at, the Pennsylvania ordinance, some of the other cluster ordinance had a minimum acreage in order to be eligible for this. I put a 20 acre minimum lot size in there, or site size. I'm conflicted about that. If the goal is open space, you know, do you need to have a maximum amount of open space to make it valuable, or could you make this available for anyone? I use the 30% open space as a starting point. Again, I showed you the examples. You could certainly modify that and discuss what number meets the goals of the city. I did not put a minimum lot size or lot width. We did talk about it at the council meeting, but given how small these lots are with 30%, I felt like it might be better to just provide some flexibility for the development community to provide lots. Typically what we were showing in these were pretty small lots, and I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. Setbacks are small, but they are consistent, fairly consistent with what we've approved in some PUDs. In order to do this, we found that you really do have to move to a 5-foot side yard setback as a standard. We did put that in there. We did include the 20-foot front yard setback. That's the standard in the district today. It's a 20-foot building setback, but you still need a 22-foot driveway, so often those will push back behind that. And then we did propose a 20-foot rear yard setback. Typically, we do require 30 under our ordinance, so we could talk a little bit about that. And then I think it's important to note, because historically we've had a lot of discussion about the code requirement that limits garage face to 55% of the front of the building elevation. You simply can't do that on these smaller lots. So the draft says you still have to comply with all of the architectural standards in our districts, except that one, that we would waive that requirement. And so as an example for reference, in this 30% example, and again, starting point for discussion, that shows that we would have 45-foot lot widths with about a 5,800 square foot lot size. It's not out of character with some of what we've already approved in Bass Lake Crossings. They had lots as small as 40 foot wide on their smallest lots. They also had some larger lots, but their smallest lots were 40 feet. Rush Creek Reserve, which hasn't been built but is behind the St. Thomas Catholic Church site. Those homes had lots as small as 55 feet for the single family and villas, and then the twin lots were 75 feet for the two twins. And Bellwether, the Pulte project, has lots as small as 44 feet wide. They do have some larger lots, but the smallest are at 45. So to provide some context for what you might see with a 30% open space. Again, every site is different. So it was intended to be a starting point for a discussion because we talked about a lot of stuff at that April meeting. So really want to open it up to the council and planning commission to provide feedback, provide direction. And then once we have an idea of what the ordinance should look like, we can talk more about next steps and schedule.
Perfect. Thank you, Kendra. I'll kind of just start off with a couple of my initial thoughts, and then maybe we can go around council first and then to the commission and take it from there. Of the options that were shown, I think the 20% I really like. 30% is kind of right on the border for me. I'd kind of like to see what the impact of a 25% conservation would be in terms of what we think the minimum lot width and size would be. But I think after that, it kind of gets to the point where you're changing the type of housing so dramatically that it might not be an appropriate fit for those zones. But under that, I think there's something workable there. I think the questions we want to think about are, do we want to have an actual minimum lot width instead of, as Kendra mentioned, more of the flexibility for a developer? Is there some number that would work at 20 or 25? Looking at the chart that Kendra included, it seems like we have done developments with this width size, with the lot width already without getting the 25 or 20% conservation in return. So that's kind of where I'm thinking it might already fit with what some of the developments we've seen and what we might be seeing in the future. It kind of fits along those same lines. So that's really my initial really general thoughts. Jeremy or Alan, if you want to share what you're thinking.
I'll defer to Alan.
My only concern is that we may develop cluster developments next to large homes, and we might have this spotty patchwork of, higher density homes with next to residential homes. And I want to know how we're going to deal with that situation so we get some even flow throughout the community.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was something I thought about too. I don't know if there's any way to try to write into the ordinance where we could have some sort of guidance as to where the open space is left open, I guess, is where the conservation space would be, whether that's abutting existing residential or abutting another zoning district, or some sort of standard to give us a guideline for that we could have some influence on it rather than just what the developer picks for that. But I don't know if that's a feasible option. But I see what you're saying, Alan, with not wanting it to be kind of haphazard with that.
Yeah, I just don't want to see a bunch of single family homes and then all of a sudden we've got clusters of townhomes in the middle of them just so we can save 3 or 4 acres of land.
Gotcha.
So.
Yeah. And I think that's why I'm more supportive of the 20 to potentially 25, where you probably wouldn't have to change the type of housing to the twin homes or townhomes. And it would stay just the single family homes, but I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I think a minimum plot size is a good idea, because that kind of, it helps us get larger parcels of land. Otherwise, we're going to have people come in here and they're going to want to put in higher density homes on a small parcel of land where that normally wouldn't be allowed, and then just save, 25% of 5 acres. That doesn't make sense to me, or 10 acres.
Yeah, the Kendra, was the example you gave 20 acre minimum?
Yes, I've seen some as small as 10 and some as big as 40, so I kind of split the baby there.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would agree, Alan. I think, I don't know what that number is, but I think a minimum size would make sense. So you're not doing it on really tiny lots there. Jeremy?
I agree with the points that you're both making. I would be open, I think, to the 20 and the 30 as they were prepared by staff. I think both of those are attractive relative to some of the other developments that we've seen come through that have a similar lot width but don't have the open space area preserved. I would also be open to address Alan's concern about mixes of housing types. Perhaps we don't allow the twins in these lower density zones, and maybe if we decide to progress with this and it works out well and we decide to apply it in medium density areas, maybe that's where we look at some of the higher density home types. So maybe the only compromise that we have is the minimum lot sizes, but we still have only single families in these kinds of developments as a way to ensure that we have that kind of continuity. I like the amount of open space. One thing that I've seen in some of the other literature, in the graphs that we have in the packet, it appears like the open space fronts the front side of the homes. I'm wondering if it might be more common or advantageous for the developers to do it such that the open space is in the rear, just for the sake of having a better impression for those homeowners. It sort of counters the smaller lot sizes because they open up into a big open forest or prairie or whatever it might be. So it might be good to show that as an alternative if we're going to draft like a 25%. Maybe we show that version with the streets shifted and the lots on the side where the open space is. That's my high level feedback. I have some nitty gritty stuff on the details of the ordinance, but I don't want to dwell on that when nobody else had a chance to speak yet.
Gotcha. So now for the fun part, let's open it up to the planning commission.
Can I ask
Chair-
one more question of
Of
staff?
course. Yeah, of course.
So if everything we're looking to propose comes to play, can't we accomplish the same without an ordinance, but doing it through PUD negotiations? I mean, we have a standard lot size right now in RSF 1. Can we allow changes to zoning and allow different mixed uses if they're willing to agree to set aside X% of land?
You could negotiate that. We don't have anything in our PUD that specifically, we talked about that as an option that specifically asks for that. But yeah, you can negotiate anything with the PUD if you have a willing partner in the negotiation.
Yeah,
I mean, I
s-
think,
so-
or sorry, go ahead.
Well, everything we're talking about is something that we've negotiated in the past. The exception is that we haven't really negotiated the set aside of land preservation with it,
Mhm.
you know?
You could, I think the idea that I think I was working from is the council said we want to preserve open space and we didn't want to make it mandatory. Because we did talk about, remember, should we amend the PUD ordinance to say you have to preserve open space, which some PUDs do. And that wasn't really the path we went down, but that is an option, either to amend the PUD ordinance or just provide direction to staff that that's something that we should be sharing with developers, that you're not going to get a PUD and the flexibility unless there's some significant open space. I mean, that could be a policy direction, I think, as well.
Yeah, I
But
think that's
this-
what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. Yes, you could. This also, though, developers don't really like PUDs. They just do them because they can't do the product that they have under our code. So if there was a way for them to avoid the PUD, there may be some developers that would be willing to say, yeah, I'll give you 25% open space or 30% open space if I can get in and get out in 3 months.
Okay, so it's better from the standpoint of a known negotiation. It's
Exactly.
known to the developer up front. Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
And kind of along that same line, I know it's been brought up a few times at planning commission meetings about maybe trying to find some ways to get away from every development being PUD. So I'd love to hear from the commission on kind of their thoughts on that, and just take it wherever you want to start. With that, if Chair Jacobs would want to get us started. Nope, I think you're muted. Dean, I think you're muted.
Sorry, my dog was running around here. Yeah, I'll start. I'm never short of words or opinions, but I read this and I'm still maybe trying to figure out what the basic goal here is. If it's to preserve open space, I see in there trying to preserve some of our better natural features. Okay. If you're going to do that, why can't we be more parcel specific? If you took Tavara, if this was something that was in place, why couldn't we have said, well, we're going to zone this cluster type development where some of it has to be preserved? So you're not giving somebody the option of choosing to do it. You're giving them, this is the way it's zoned and that's the way it's going to be. If the idea of this new zoning ordinance is to, make it feel more country, I happen to think that the 20% is a complete waste of time. What are you going to accomplish by just putting more houses closer together with a couple of acres set aside that it could, you really don't know what it's going to achieve. And those that know me long enough, I'm certainly not, a townhouse guy or something, but the only thing I thought that looked attractive as far as trying to preserve open space was 40 or 50%. If we build townhomes or twin homes or anything like that, that's seeming to me what all the developers want to build. And so why would they have a problem if they can get more housing units and we can save, if you're working with 40 or 50% open space, that can go a long way with really creating, some significant open area. The concern that I would have with all of this is then what kind of area? If a developer just goes and buys an 80-acre farm field and says, yeah, we're going to give you 40% of an open farm field, well, I don't see a lot of particular value in it. And then we're going to turn it over to homeowners association. So how's it going to be any good unless it's really on an arterial road? I think I read from it, you can still farm it. That's cool. I like that idea. If the purpose of our zoning is to maintain a rural feel within our community, I think maybe one of the best ways is just create exceptionally large setbacks from our major roads. Your County Road 10s, your County Road 116s, and County Road 50s, such that, you won't see the development. I mean, you drive through some of the other parts of Maple Grove and Plymouth, they got entire townhomes and twin home developments in there right alongside these roads, but you wouldn't ever know they were even there. Now, it doesn't give you a country feel, but it certainly doesn't feel like you're walking through a suburban jungle. I guess the long and short of my opinion is, maybe this kind of goes along with Alan, saving 30% open space, I guess it would depend upon what that open space is. If it's really, really good hardwood stuff, it seems to me that our developers in Corcoran they're not interested in preserving trees for the benefit of either a single lot or an entire neighborhood. They'd rather just plow it under and develop it. If we can get them to, save that, then maybe, something like your 30% model will work. but if it's doing nothing more than just saving, really a space that isn't going to be very useful to anybody in the community, I think we're just making a lot of homes on a lot of small lots. So
Gotcha.
I'll turn.
Can I?
Couple quick questions for,
Well,
sorry, let me go first and then I'll get Jeremy. Is that you?
Yeah, well,
Quick question for Kendra. We discussed briefly focusing it more on, as an option, focusing it more on the specific natural characteristics that you're trying to preserve. Isn't that a kind of a different route, but something that could be done as opposed to, sorry, go on.
Yeah, that is one of the options we presented to the council at the April meeting. One of the options was the idea of requiring what we've identified as significant natural resources in the city, requiring preservation of those. And the council, I think all of you felt that requiring preservation was not a path you wanted to go down to and wanted to use incentives. And then we talked about whether, this should only apply to high quality natural resource areas, but the council did suggest, we like those, but any open space is valuable to us. And so that's the path. So we did talk about just focusing on those, and we talked about requiring it and decided that wasn't the route we wanted to go down.
Gotcha. Thank you. Jeremy, if you want to go ahead.
you started down the same rabbit hole I was going to dive into. My question was, what do we think of the idea of if somebody's going to propose a conservation subdivision? What if we require, if there are high quality natural resources on the site, that say half of the preservation plot has to include those resources? As a way to ensure that if there is a natural area that we want to preserve and they're going to do the open space model, that they're not plowing all of those under and preserving something that is less valuable.
Yeah, that seems something worth looking into. How about we, unless you have a follow-up, Jeremy, I think that's a good point. If whoever wants to take it next in the planning commission, feel free to jump in.
Mayor, can I just make one comment? I did want
Absolutely.
to say, to Alan's point earlier, a conservation development that's being proposed, and you're looking for a buffer between, existing maybe larger lots, acreage lots, and that, I think those, whatever you put into conservation, that might be a real good buffer for that transition.
Yeah. Would like to go next.
I can go next.
Perfect. Thanks, Meredith.
I have a couple of points about the size of the 20 acres. I'm thinking that could be a roundtable discussion with developers, because there may be an economy of scale there that they know works from a marketing standpoint, from a business standpoint. I mean, if we apply it to a 10-acre site and the developer can tell you that they can never, no matter what they build, based on current zoning requirements in any city, they can't make 10 acres work, then I think that's a moot point. So I think asking in a roundtable discussion with developers is a good idea there. I don't know the difference between permanent conservation easement, covenant, and deed restriction. I don't know what the differences are, so I'd appreciate knowing those differences. They're all mentioned in the document, but I don't know what the differences are. I also felt that the driver in locating these would be overlaying the RSF2 and RSF3 with the natural resource environment map and seeing where they occur and trying to incentivize the preservation of those items. It sounds like this has come up in City Council. You felt that you didn't want to do it. But my question to you is, then how do you want to do it? How do you want to protect those resources? Because we know that if we leave it to the market, and Tavera is a great example, they will be removed and they will be erased. For me, when you talk about an incentive, and I'm sure you've discussed this, but I'm trying to understand why there isn't some kind of discount in park dedication to a developer. If they're going to provide this area, and maybe it becomes something that there's a public easement that is mandatory if they take the discount in the park dedication, but wouldn't that be a financial incentive to a developer? Because I know that park dedication is quite a, I suppose one word would be lucrative in that it does provide a lot of money to the city, but if we're trying to incentivize developers, isn't that the carrot that we could use, at least discount it to some point? I think it does reward community-wide access to these open spaces if there is a discount to the developer, but of course there would have to be the public access easement so that the public can actually use it. Thanks.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, especially with the park dedication. That'd be interesting to look into some more. Maybe Kendra, if you could shine a little light out, if that's something that could be worked into it.
Well, what I would say is our park dedication fees are calculated based on our adopted comprehensive plan and the maps and trails in that plan. So we collect fees so we can acquire that land for our parks. And if we start waiving fees for parks, then we're out of balance for what we're collecting versus what we want to purchase. And so that's something the council needs to be aware of. I would caution against waiving park dedication fees for land that's not part of our parks program for that reason, but certainly is an option that the council consider. There just are budget implications.
Right. Gotcha. Appreciate it.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to follow on that conversation, I like the concept. One thing we could consider, if the development is going to include, say, walking trails through the open area, perhaps we would give a credit for that area against their park dedication if they're made public. So if it's not part of the trail plan, but it's still going to be available and accessible to the broader network, maybe that could be a justification for giving a discount for that space.
Yeah. Kendra, thoughts on that? Does that make it a little more feasible, or is it still the same problem of not being on the comprehensive plan?
Well, that's what we currently do though, right? We currently give credit for people that want to put trails in developments.
If it's on the comp plan.
Correct, Mr. Mayor, you are correct.
But neighborhood trails, I mean, talking about the trails through Ravinia and the trails through, what's this new one called up here?
Tavera.
Now I'm going to refer to it as Sawgrass. If everybody
Rush
knows
Creek
what that
Reserve.
is. Yeah. You know, were those trails on active maps in the past, or those are just neighborhood trails, aren't they?
Both. There are trails that are shown on the comprehensive plan and we give them credit for those. There are in Rush Creek Reserve, they run along the creek on the north and then northwest from the creek down to 10. But there are other trails in that development that they are not getting park dedication credit for, but are required to provide them to provide a pedestrian connection.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you on that.
No, that's great. Commissioner Lanterman, would you like to go next? See, you're next on my screen.
I would. Thank you, Mayor McKee. Because it's helpful to me in understanding things, I like to simplify or perhaps oversimplify what we're dealing with. And tonight it's urban clustering, which is basically a fancy term for leaving land open, but having to look through a bunch of crammed houses to see it. The proposal states that, quote, the exhibits show that preservation of open space will require smaller lots or a change in unit type. It seems likely that development with more than 30% open space will require attached housing in order to meet the minimum density goals adopted by the comprehensive plan, end quote. In my opinion, these proposed changes to the code will not have a meaningful impact on protecting open space And consequently, what is desirable about Corcoran will be totally pillaged by development. In practice, this seems, at least on my read, that it has absolutely no teeth. The staff report says that, quote, the new ordinance would follow the OSMP, that's the open space and plat section, but then goes on to say that, quote, the open space must be a conservation easement owned and maintained by an HOA. In the OSMP plats, the easements must be temporary so that they could be developed in the future should municipal sewer and water become available. However, these parcels will have utilities. So I'm curious as to what this means in practice, because it seems like a backdoor for developers to simply obtain authorization to put ultra dense housing in without really having to give up developable acreage. It sounds like a totally lopsided deal in favor of developers. And on this temporary nature of the easement, I didn't see anything expressed in the proposed code, but it does state that, quote, the owner of such land and buildings shall provide covenants as approved by the city to ensure their continued operation and maintenance to a predetermined reasonable standard, end quote. So I'm curious, what is this standard? Is it until one phase of a build is done? HOAs are often controlled by the developer for years while a project is being phased. And my second practical concern is that this will not incentivize developers. Couldn't the developer use a series of subdivisions to take advantage of urban clustering? For example, a 100-acre lot could be divided into fourths. 1/4 is used for urban clustering. The other 3/4 can be used for anything else. It just seems to me like it could just be a way for developers to do whatever they want and offer whatever products they want to without really respecting the intent of preserving open space. Thank you for this time.
Thanks, Mark. You raised some really good points there. Kendra, there was a lot in there. If maybe you could shine a little light on particularly Mark's point about through phasing, if a developer could come in and kind of manipulate, what areas they're doing their standard development versus the conservation development, and kind of cherry picking the best of both worlds for them.
Yeah. Well, that's what they make money doing, is picking the best. So it's our job to make sure we have an ordinance that accomplishes what we want to. The intent of this, as noted in the staff report, and perhaps not as clear as it should be yet in the draft language, is that this is permanent conservation, so that it's different from the rural conservation where we have to make it temporary conservation until sewer and water is available. My intent here was to say that open space needs to be in a permanent conservation easement, and that restrictive covenants need to be applied. And so if that's not in there specifically, I need to change that. But that was the intent, is that we do not want developers doing that. So we need to protect that land in perpetuity. And I think that was kind of the main gist of the redevelopment of that open space, I think, was the main concern.
Yeah, I think those, Mark, was those the two kind of big points?
Yeah, those were my two main points. And if it helps, I'm fine putting this, in an email or a letter. Just, I know it's hard remembering everything I threw at you, but I'm fine drafting an email with those points. But again, my concern is a developer coming in, developing a quarter of a massive lot. And with the way this is written, it appears to me as though that developer over time could essentially do whatever they would like to do with that remaining land. So Thank you.
Kendra, were you going to say something?
I was gonna agree that we don't want that. We want to
Right.
protect that in perpetuity.
Right. No, those are really good points, Mark. Thank you.
Mayor,
Yeah,
if I may, I mean, I
of
think
course.
to Mark's point, you could have a builder buy 400 acres and ask for cluster development on 50 of the acres, put all townhomes in, and then build the rest in single family homes and only preserve a small portion of the acreage. They don't have to do it through phasing. They just have to do it through the presentation, right? They come in through one preliminary plot on a small portion and ask for it that way.
And then they do like a
It's just
separate development.
semantics and how they do it. Yeah. So instead
Gotcha.
of somebody like Tavera coming in and giving you 10 phases, what they would end up doing is splitting all 10 into 10 different developments. And have conservation on one of those 10. And then they come in with the rest of the 9, 6 months later as a separate development, although it abuts the existing development and our hand is forced.
That's correct.
How would our hand be forced? Wouldn't they be subject to the requirements of the new submission? So if you're,
They'd be, the new submission would fall under RSF 1. So you wouldn't have preserved anything under that whole existing portion of RSF 1 in the remaining portion of that development. I mean, they're basically, instead of being one development in 9 phases, you have 9 developments in single phases.
so you would have the first one would be a cluster,
Yep,
and your concern is that 2 through 9 wouldn't be a cluster. Is that right?
correct.
Okay, but that's
Wouldn't part of that be addressed by the minimum acreage? So if you had a 50 acre minimum, or just, I think 20 was
Well,
the
yeah,
example.
I mean, that's to Meredith's point. We'd have to establish what that minimum is, and the minimum might be so high that nobody uses it.
Right.
But
At
let's
Tamara's point
stop
about
that.
the developer roundtable.
So
Right.
they
yeah.
would get the favorable treatment of having no minimum lot size in exchange for the preservation on the first submission. But the next one, if they're not doing conservation on the next one, they wouldn't be able to use the same requirements. They'll be back into the conventional development ordinance or a PUD for the remainder.
Right, which they're not obligated in any way, shape, or form to preserve anything
On the other
on the rest of it.
undeveloped portion.
Right.
So that's what we're gonna get whenever we make it optional, right? We can't.
Yeah, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
Optional for this.
It would still be preserving whatever the percentage was on that initial development. They wouldn't be able to encroach on, you know, if it's 20% on the, even if they were to split it into several developments. First development is 30 acres, 20% of that would be preserved.
Mhm.
And the next development they wanted to do separately next to it still couldn't encroach on that 20% or whatever we're preserving.
Right, but I mean, I think my point would be is if it's currently zoned for RSF1, they could come in and say, okay, well, the minimum is 30 acres. Let's just do 30 acres and get our high density townhomes in that, and we preserve, you know,
Yeah.
30% of that, and then the rest of it we just do townhomes, not preserve anything on it.
I see what you're saying.
I mean, there's ways to manipulate anything, but
Well,
I would be open to removing the multimodal housing types, like we talked about in the very beginning. I hear your concern there, Alan, and I wouldn't want to see, you know, high density townhomes in a low density area at the level that we might see, as I see it drawn out. So I'd be very fine with an edit if we all agree to only allow the type that's normally permitted in the underlying zoning district. Even if that means we don't necessarily get to the higher levels of preservation.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, although it kind of brings me back to Dean Jacobs's point about he'd prefer the bigger percentages of open space that you're preserving. And I think I forgot to follow up with you on that, Dean. Is that you'd still prefer that even with the higher density or more intense type of housing that would have to go in there at those levels?
Listen, I don't think there's any way the city's going to get around that type of development happening eventually.
Mhm.
And I think that if a particular parcel of land is bought by a developer and it has a high percentage, you know, I mean, the developer is saving costs too, because there's less roads, less infrastructure. But you've got enough land to play around with where you can shield it, make it all still feel very residential, but there you're preserving at least some significant land.
Gotcha.
I mean, if you're talking a minimum of let's just say a 40-acre parcel of land, you're saving, you're preserving 20 acres. And that can be used as your buffer zones between existing neighborhoods. Like if you put that type of development right behind mine, and yet it was 300 feet away, that'd be great for me. If it's 300 feet away from a road and everything else, it'd be great for the city. Then, so I see that as you're going to have this evil one way or the other. I mean, again, I'm not a big fan of it, but I don't think we're ever going to get away from it. So if we're going to incentivize people to save land and to make it as rural as possible, I think that to me seems more, and I think we've heard variations here that, preserving 6 acres really doesn't do a whole lot. I mean, it can be wasted space just to do more, confined homes. And
Gotcha.
so.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Dean Varenkamp, if you'd like to go next.
I would love to give it a shot.
Sounds good.
Some great comments by everybody. I've got some bullet points written down, but kind of by what you guys are talking or what we're talking about is we've got two kind of situations going on. We got rural ag, which is most of the rest of the city. And then we got bunch of residential zones that we're kind of talking about. The last thing I wanted to see was houses closer together, even in the MUSA line or the area that we can develop. I'm concerned about, you guys, we were talking about it, park dedication fees. That gets us what we want and helps us acquire properties and such where we would like parks and such, which is great. But I think that park dedication fee is a 10% land or 10% cost, if I remember that number, if there is a number set to that. Is that right, Kendra?
I believe it's 15.
Is it 15?
It varies based on the land use category.
Okay.
So
All right. Yeah, that's a huge equation, but if it's 15% and we go to, I think, Jeremy, you were talking a 25% conservation fee, essentially the developer would be conserving 40% of the property, so to speak, in just simple calculations and such. Again, I guess, there's so many ways a person can go on this. In the current MUSA or the current area we can develop right now, I think the houses are too close together. I think I'm concerned about roads being too narrow, houses being too close, public safety related to fires and those kind of things. So those are some of my concerns. The second thing that I wrote down was who's responsible for that open space. We keep talking about homeowners associations and those kind of things, but wouldn't we need to put in what the city's expectations would be if it's open space and the homeowners association decided to do nothing? We would have weed control issues, all of those things going on. I think we'd have to write a whole bunch of things to make it approved by those of us, being the city council, mayor, all of us, making it appealing to the eye, I'm going to say. Gotcha. Again, my thing that I would like to see is just larger lots. The open space being privately held homes, the property owners being responsible for taking care of it instead of putting clusters together, if that makes sense. We recently had the Paulson Farms, which I really liked. Number one, I'm a neighbor to it, or was a neighbor to it. It's gone away now. But essentially 45 acres was going to be developed and 45 acres was going to be left alone until the development or sewer and water would come out this far. I was concerned that we would have 45 acres developed, so to speak, with open space all around, properties averaging or going from 1.5 acres, I think, to a little over 3 acres a parcel. So I think it was 18 to 20 homes on those 40 acres. And then I was wondering what was going to happen with those other 45 acres until that development happened. And what I would worry about is we got homes that are set apart, and then all of a sudden sewer and water would come out, roads would come through, and then what would happen on those 45 leftover acres? You know, we're going to jam townhomes and all of those things. It's a long way down the calendar and such, but just thinking out loud, wondering what would happen with, you know, current kind of things we've already done. What else did I write? And then I'll be quiet. I don't know if I made sense on what I was talking about. I was trying not to repeat what Meredith said or Mark said. And then Dean, you and I kind of have the same mindset. I'd rather see it a little bit more controlled on our side. I'd rather see developers come in and tell us what they're going to do to not preserve, but build around those natural resources that we like, the clumps of trees, the wetlands, those kind of things. And I think a lot of us have said it sure would be nice if we could stop seeing PUDs or conditional use permits on anything that comes in front of us. And it'd be great to see a development come in and not requesting anything. But I think that's probably too much to expect for us, considering the current prices that are being paid for a lot of this land right now. So a little bit mumble jumble. Thank you, Mayor McGee. Thank you, everybody, for your input. This is so cool to do as a group. Instead of just putting it on 5 people and stuff.
I love it.
It's great. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot of good feedback there. I'm still taking some notes. Commissioner Schulach, if you want to weigh in, and then we can kind of go back around if anyone has questions, or just kind of jump around wherever.
Sure.
After that.
Thank you, sir. We've been talking a lot about the developers right now, but as I read it, I was interested about the landowners, the people who would receive offers from developers for their land, and what type of land the homeowner might have. For example, how are we going to define or identify space preserved? Is it on a value basis? You know, someone mentioned before that 40 acres of agriculture is important and everything, but it's not like it's got hills and some very mature trees, some wetlands, a great view. And so, you know, then my mind started to think, well, okay, we take a drone and we go around the 6 miles by 6 miles, and we identify these certain places that have intrinsic value or worth preserving. And then we send out letters to homeowners or landowners and say, congratulations, 6 out of your 18 acres are worth preserving, you know, or however we word it. Not that it's any type of legal thing, but it makes people think, well, okay, if a developer comes, I think I like these trees too, so I would like to see them preserved. But then the other hand, just recently, up here on County Road 10, the person who owned the land just basically stripped it of all the trees before he sold. And so what's to keep, obviously identifying space worth preserving would be ideal if we could do it, if the landowners would go along with it. But ultimately, what it comes down to, I think, is that some people just don't care as much about hills and wetlands and sunsets or whatever, and they're more concerned about, I've been living on this land for 3 generations, it's time to move into something that's better for me and my spouse. So I don't know, I guess I would love to see a perfect solution to this, but either we're going to identify these spaces as valuable to Corcoran, or we're going to have to judge them on a case-by-case matter. And so if a developer A comes to see us and wants 40 acres of the old farmer's farm, and we tell them that so much has to be saved, we're going to have to make a judgment on that. And maybe it's all agriculture, and maybe there's then developer B comes in and, oh, he's got these plans for the 40 acres and it's got wetlands and hills and trees and everything. And so we're going to say, no, you can't do that because, gosh, you got to reserve so many percentage of that. And he or she will come back and say, but the last person, they had a much easier time because that land wasn't considered as preservable, if that's a word. I don't know. I'm going back and forth, but I'm just sad because I think most of us are concerned about preserving the character of not only Corcoran, but of the world. I mean, trees and wildlife and things like that. And none of us would like to see Corcoran become a patchwork of subdivisions. And so that's what I wrestle with. And I thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Jim. Following up on that, I guess to Councilor Schultz and Nichols, we had in our conversation initially on this, we kind of got away from focusing it on the natural characteristics. What do you think, kind of given some of the comments of the Planning Commission, about focusing it more towards those actual areas of significance, or I forget exactly the term we use for designating them? Not all at once.
I think it becomes difficult because it becomes subjective and who feels what's significant, and how are you going to measure that, and who's the winner and who's the loser. I mean, if you want to get to preservation of larger lots, which some people are saying, I guess you could go and just look at minimum lot sizes and step away from PUDs in all regard. But the thing is with that is you have to realize the secondary effect is you're going to kill development, and you're going to drive down land prices because you're going to have a lot less developers coming in to develop land. So
right,
it's a trade-off. What do you got to figure out what's important to you? Is it lot size? Is it preservation of land? You're going to definitely preserve land if you drive developers away, because there's going to be nobody to build.
Right. Yeah. Well, we have a map, Kendra, don't we, of some I forget the term we use, but
Resource areas.
yes. I mean, would that be a basis for some of this to work around?
Mr. Mayor, that was one of the options we provided last month as a potential overlay district. If you recall, we do have a couple of different natural resource areas. We have significant natural resources, I think it's called. And it provides a greenway corridor for wildlife and just connected open space. So that is a different path that you could go down
Gotcha.
in the cluster.
Just to revisit that, so when
Yeah.
we talked about that before, a number of members of council were concerned about creating a mandatory requirement, even in certain areas, and then that having a perverse effect of driving landowners to destroy those resources. So that's why we opted to pursue the path of trying to keep it optional and incentivize it. And that's the direction that we gave to staff to come back with a proposal that does that. And I think they have done exactly what we asked them to do. I too would like to see a lot of those natural resource areas preserved. I also don't want to cause their destruction by the policy that we create, which is why I supported this draft being created. I would like to see what we could do within the scope of this option to enhance the probability of those higher valued areas being preserved. So I floated the idea after Chair Jacobs spoke about if there's a high value area on a parcel, maybe in order to qualify to use this and avoid having to do a PUD, a certain proportion of those valuable spaces need to be part of the conservation area. I think that has a viable chance of being successful. If there are other ideas that staff or council or planning commission members might have that would further that, I'm very open and would love to hear any other ideas.
I don't know if I have another idea. I mean, I think that's worth looking into, absolutely. I don't know if I have another way of kind of accomplishing that same thing.
My question would be is how, if we've identified high value areas in only certain areas, would we have to then go back and look at high value areas in all parcels in excess of the minimum plot for this ordinance? Because obviously there's going to be some plots that are going to meet that minimum size. If we come up with a minimum, that aren't going to have any high value areas.
Mhm.
And then what?
Okay.
They're just,
We talked
they
about
just don't, it won't work for them.
No, what we talked about last time, I think, was, and Kendra raised this point, if you've got a farm field and it's not considered high value from a natural resources perspective or a vista perspective, what do you do to make that something that's worthwhile? So we talked about last time, if you've got something that's not already valuable in that way, maybe you, there could be a requirement within the subdivision ordinance that we would require it to be planted with native grasses and flowers and convert it into a meadow, or whatever topography makes sense for that particular parcel could be part of the plan that we put in place to steward that parcel over time. So that would be part of the deal, essentially, that the developer would make with the city as they put this all together. So if there's not already a high value area there, essentially the ask in the ordinance would be, you need to create something that's worth preserving.
Mr. Mayor, would it
Yeah.
be helpful for me to share the map of the natural resource inventory just briefly? I could just touch
That'd be
on
great.
kind of what we shared with you last month or April. Whoops, that's not the right screen. I'm having such trouble with my screens here tonight.
But Kendra, we would only be looking at anything inside the Muciline, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So am I sharing my screen right now?
No.
Okay.
Now, my planning commissioners can affirm I'm not usually this bad at this. How about now?
There it is.
Yep.
Okay. So this map we shared with the council at the April meeting when we talked about the overlay. And there's two things overlaid on that map. The base map is the natural resource inventory, which is part of the comprehensive plan. This is based on the natural plant communities management plan done by Bonestro for the city back in 2001. So at the time, they studied the city, they walked the city, and they identified these as high quality natural resource areas. And what we did was we laid over that something that we used to call the Greenway Corridor, and that's that hashed line. And so you can see that, I would say more than half of the areas in the MUSA have identified a significant natural resource corridor, but not all of them. This is the site where we had Wright Hennepin proposing a substation. If you remember, this 40 acres has nothing on it. The golf course next to it does have a little bit of a significant natural resource. So you could, using this cluster idea, if you wanted to go ahead, you could make it a requirement that if you do a cluster, part of your open space must encompass all of the natural resource areas identified on this map, for example. So you'd still make the idea of the cluster optional, but if you choose to do it, and if you have a significant natural area, you have to make that your open space.
Gotcha.
And then alternatively, if you looked at this, Councilmember Nichols is spot on. He brought forward the example of Wildflower in Lake Elmo, where they created a Wildflower Meadow as part of their open space, as part of their plat. You would need to come forward with, how am I going to preserve and maintain this open space? So those are a couple ways. If you decided to go forward, you could use the data we have about quality natural resources in the city and require preservation should someone choose this optional plan.
Gotcha.
I'm wondering, Kendra, if we're being optimistic and viewing data that's 20 years old. I mean, there's been some changes in Corcoran in the last 20 years, I'm sure. And, if we were to overlay the boundary of the MUSA and then look at what development's taking place or planning to take place, I can see that that area where Tavera is going would be vastly changed than what I'm seeing here. So I'm wondering that if we move forward with involving the use of the natural resource inventory area, that we actually use up-to-date data.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. Although we have a second significant natural resource map that includes the most current DNR data, and that's pretty similar to this, other than the areas, of course, where development has occurred.
But if we're looking, but are we still limiting our scope to RSF2 and RSF3 districts? Or we're talking more generally now?
Well, I think that's up to the mayor.
That's
I
what I'm
wanted to share
saying.
this info.
Yeah.
That's my question.
I'd be open to whatever you're thinking. I think the RSF2 and RSF3 were just kind of thrown out as two potential examples that it could work in, but I'm not specifically tied to just that or those in general. If you have some different thoughts on that, I'd love to hear.
Well, I think that's one of the questions that's posed in the document early on is limiting this focus to a low residential district appropriate. But if people are not wanting to see higher density product types such as townhomes, then you kind of are limiting it to single family or twin home zoned areas. So I guess I just wasn't sure, now that we're looking at the natural resource areas, are we looking at now preserving those no matter what the district is, no matter what the development type can or cannot be based on our ordinance?
I think it would be interesting to see what could be done in a medium density zone where you already would allow multifamily. What kind of open space preservation would be possible? And what would be
go ahead.
So, for example, if you've got a zone where you're already allowing townhomes, are there other things that you could be flexible on besides housing type to enable the ability to get to that 6 to 8 units per acre that we're targeting in those higher density areas, and how much open space could be preserved? I don't think we need to limit it to low density. I think this was just sort of an example that staff put together because there's so much low density land guided in the city. But I wouldn't see any requirement that we only do it there if there's a feasible way to do it in other places too.
Yeah, I think maybe some of the issue would be how much land do we have that's zoned or guided for the, medium density or high density or mixed compared to what we have in the RSF zones. It doesn't seem like it's nearly as much and nearly as big of lots, generally speaking. So does that limit how it could be used there? Or if it could be used there at all, even if we were to allow it, if in practice we couldn't actually do anything with it. But I mean, I have no problem with, I kind of like the idea of looking at other zones to do it and if it's feasible. But, well, this was a lot of good feedback, I think, in terms of just taking a look at the clock. We're getting a little close to 7. I think regardless, this is going to take more that, another work session and further discussion. I really like Meredith's idea of maybe bringing in some developers for a roundtable and getting some feedback on what aspects of this they would actually use or could work with. I like where the discussions led in terms of some of the natural resource, identified natural resource areas and building it around that in some way, whether it's has to encompass all of it, or I think Jeremy, your idea was half of it has to be included in the conservation. I think maybe exploring that aspect of it a little more, making sure we have the updated maps with natural resources, and maybe taking a look more at where those natural resources lay out with what we have guided as opposed to just what we have zoned, as RSF 1, 2, or 3, would maybe be next steps for further discussion on this at a later date. But I will open it up to anyone to jump out with their thoughts on that.
When it comes to incentives, I'd like to, I think Meredith's kind of on the right tone there with in exchange, incentivize developers for park dedication fees. And then yet there's got to be a public access to that. I think there's certainly some concern over the HOA, but I'm wondering, could we incentivize also through the cost of infrastructure development? And what I'm trying to think of here is, I think that this idea certainly works better when it's not in the hands of a major #1 largest worldwide home developer ever made, if you guys get my drift.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking, actually, before we got this packet, about, setting up some sort of incentives where we could have subdivisions where, my subdivision, for instance, was the owner put in the road, had the engineers, subdivide out the lots, created the lots, did everything, and then they sold the lots. So every single lot here was sold to me or another individual, and they brought in their own builders. We got a great diversity of homes, but that's beside the point, because I'm outside of that. We're not talking about that. But what if we try to incentivize using smaller local builders and whatnot to accomplish this? Because I think the smaller developers would certainly want to build upon using the natural characteristics of a piece of land to develop their homes, because the other national developers, they're all about volume. And I think that's one of the major things that scares the heck out of me the most. But a small developer, of course, maybe he can't swing maybe some of those infrastructure costs. So that's just one of my thoughts is how can we incentivize them through maybe some financial assistance in those costs? And I'm done.
Yeah. I think maybe if we could have staff look into ways to incentivize, like Dean said, on the infrastructure or other things that might incentivize that type of development. I'd love to see that personally. I think it might be tricky, but there could be a lot of different types of incentives that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head that might actually work for that.
Mayor and council, that would be where Meredith's point comes in. That'd be a great question for developers. What does incentivize? What matters to you? Because we can think all we want, but we're not in their spreadsheets and their boardrooms.
Yep.
I like it.
So maybe that's where we go then. Getting some developers and making sure, kind of to Dean's point, that it's not necessarily just the large national home builders, try to get a variety of people and different size and type of builders in to get feedback from. And like I said previously, focusing some on the natural resources a little bit more than we had initially going into this, and a couple of those other changes, and see where that takes us, and set up another work session maybe after, speak to developers and get some of that feedback and see what we have to work with there.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm new here. Okay, you guys have been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I'm still trying to wrap my arms around some of these issues. But when I hear that there's yet another option for developers to potentially destroy the whole reason why people want to be here, I just want to make sure that these issues are thought through well. And on that final point, with respect to the comprehensive plan, do we know, is that binding? And if so, can it be amended?
A Kendra question.
Yeah, yes, Mr. Mayor, yes to both. It is binding. In fact, there are cities that have lost lawsuits about this, but it can be amended within the context of the requirements of the comprehensive plan and the enabling legislation.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
The other thing that we want to make sure, not only the developers, but the landowners.
Absolutely.
It would be nice to hear from landowners, and I don't want to, while we got to include the major landowners, we've got a few of them in town that own a lot, but some of the other people, we got to include everybody, not just the major players in these properties and such. So thanks.
I support that 100%. So I think, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask Mr. Mayor, I think if we're looking at this, I wanted to know if you could summarize what the direction to staff is. Are we working from this and making a couple changes and then scheduling the roundtable for review of this concept for discussion? Kind of.
Yeah,
I think that's what I heard.
I think generally, yes. I think taking some of these tweaks that were discussed, setting up a developer roundtable to get feedback, setting up some sort of public feedback opportunity for, as to Dean Varenkamp's point, not just the necessarily large landowners in town, but people around that, and just I want it as open as possible, honestly. And seeing how the ordinance gets, kind of like it did here, gets crafted out of that, and then I think we would take it from there and see if it's something that after that input makes sense, or at least is tweakable to get to something where we are or where we'd like it, or if not, then maybe we have to reassess. Does that make sense? Is that correct?
Thank you.
All righty.
Yes,
Well,
I think that makes sense, and we have direction. We can work in with Brad can work with you to set some meeting dates.
sounds good. And if I missed anything, anyone, feel free to shout it out now before we wrap up here. But hopefully that was a decent summary.
Did I forget to mention the easiest way to get out of all this is to get out from underneath the Met Council?
You tell me how, and Sign me up.
Why didn't I think of that, Dean?
Are you on the bottom succession email list? Can I ask you a question? Is there any way of knowing, we have a minimum lot size in RSF1 right now, right? When you generally don't follow it because everything's been PUD, but what would the minimum lot, what's the maximum minimum we could go to qualify and still meet our densities? Does that make sense?
Yes, so we do have an RSF1 zoning district, but that's really for the existing neighborhoods. We really don't use it much. We do say the RSF2 district is what any new development will come in at. And the RSF2 district has an 11,000 square foot lot size. And that's that first example I showed tonight. That really is right at 3 units an acre. If you
Okay,
do 11,000 square foot lots, 80 feet wide, you're right at that. If you did a little narrower lot, you know, you might be able to be above that and therefore increase the lot size, if that makes sense. You could do a narrower lot and increase the minimum lot or the minimum lot size.
okay. All right, thank you.
Alrighty, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate y'all taking the time, and I hope to do some more of these. I think there's a lot of other issues that would be great to talk through with you guys and kind of take up. I know I just watching planning commission meetings, there's a lot of different ideas that have come up that I'd really like to dive into some more. So hopefully we can get that scheduled in the future. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and we will hop off here, and council will, I'll see you guys at least in 7 minutes, 6 minutes.
I just like to thank everyone as well for their input, and I'd like to reiterate, they can reach out to any of us council members individually
Absolutely.
and share their feedback as well as what their thoughts and visions are for the city.
Please do.
Thank you all.
We do need a motion to adjourn as well, just before we.
I will go ahead and make the motion to adjourn.
Second.
Roll call vote. McKee, aye. Nichols,
Abstain.
Schultz.
Aye.
Had to run the math for a second. It was, fortunately, John's not here. We'd have 2 abstentions and all sorts of trouble. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I know.
Have a good
Bye.
one.